Hey y'all, Mac here. I wanted to say that Penance Brand is honestly one of the most well-balanced and flexible builds I have played, and the actual value of the build lies in its ability to just go relatively defensive without having to give up that much damage. The skill itself is already very overtuned, I think, and so you can invest a lot more into just having survivability, and that's exactly what I've done with my setup. Now, while there may be better setups to use like high ticket items like that, you're still able to kind of build this without those, and I'll discuss some alternative options later on in my build explanation and like kind of general gearing tips. But I wanted to kind of introduce this just by going over how it's been and how I've like converted this character, which is a Poison Pathfinder, to this setup. So originally I had started this Pathfinder as Toxic Rain, just as the League starter, and eventually it became Exsanguinate, and Exsanguinate was a lot of fun to play. Like, being able to chain full screens of mobs was really nice. However, I had to put a lot of points into damage and a lot of gear investment into it as well, and so I gave up a lot of defensives, which made the build overall not as tanky as I would have liked it. It was sitting at around like 45-50k EHP without any guards up, and so it was okay. It was okay for like Legion mapping. Even some of the juice content was okay, but the damage actually started to fall off for juice content, and it just didn't have the single target to keep up without dying in these maps. And so I wanted to pivot to this new skill. Now, Penance Brand generally is probably better with Nebula setup. You can scale the damage way higher, since Poison Dot Cap is sitting at around 32-35 mil. So you're not getting any more damage than that. However, you don't really need any more damage than that, and I am a very strong believer that if you can clear these maps very smoothly with a lot less effort and a lot more safety, overall your efficiency is probably going to be better versus if you're like dying constantly just for the sake of having more damage. And quite realistically, my setup just doesn't die in these maps. I fixed the degen problem with Leech Shade and all that, and so I'll go over a lot of that in a little bit, but the actual like defensive layers that this build has is just absurd. It just does not die. And like I can honestly take points out of life and stuff and put it into more damage even if I wanted to. But yeah, the big TLDR I think for this build is that the way you can set up Penance Brand is just extremely flexible. You have so many options, and while the skill itself doesn't clear well at all, it's actually probably one of the worst skills for clear, you can scale the clearing through a lot of various means, which I'm going to go over. But again, I will say that it is a much better bosser than it is a mapper. But you can still map on it quite successfully, and it may even feel pretty good, as it's a very chill playstyle. And I've actually turned this build into a one-handed build because my other hand is still broken and still recovering, so yeah. Hey, so this build utilizes a lot of very expensive items, and I'm going to try my best to kind of provide alternatives as well as how I scaled up the build. But yeah, let's just get started. So first things first, I use a Dendrobate in order to get chance to poison support, and this setup allows me to also take advantage of the 15% life mastery on the tree. Now the big thing with this is that you can run a lightning coil instead for an absurd amount of extra defenses. The downside to that is you lose out on a lot of the poison damage, and you need to find chance to poison somewhere else, usually through clusters. I don't really recommend that if you're trying to run Poison Penance Brand, as you're giving up a lot of like other defensive capabilities that you can scale with the build due to how much base damage it already has. Gem links are going to be Empowered, Deadly Elements, Unbound Elements, Penance Brand, Swift Brand, and Void Manip. I swap out Void Manip for item rarity if I'm doing absurdly juiced maps, and that in and of itself is already enough damage. But obviously you're going to lose a lot of single target doing that, so up to you. Swift Brand is just really nice quality of life, so I would highly recommend running it. So as far as the damage scaling goes, I'm running an Original Sin. The alternative is you can throw another Ming's Heart here. You lose some EHP, you lose around 6 passive skill points on the tree, and you're also having to run a Despair Curse, which is obviously not as good as just having nearby enemy Chaos Res at 0. So without saying, Aznats is really nice, gives us temp chains on hit, and that allows us to scale the poison duration. And not only that, um, it gives us a little bit of exploding. It's not a substantial amount, but it is notable for mapping, and I think it's very crucial to have this if you plan on mapping with this build. So what I'm trying to say is, if you can't afford an original sin, you can always go with a Ming's Heart, and you can roll with a Curse Despair on hit, and you're going to be pathing up towards Whispers of Doom. So you'll take this cluster setup, and you can run like hindered, curse enemies are hindered, and then run like a chaos cluster if you want to, in order to scale chaos damage taken. But I'm not doing that, obviously. With an original sin, I'm gonna only be running one Ming's Heart. We still get a lot of Fizz as extra chaos, and a lot of chaos res on this. I hit a lucky double corrupt, and I hit bleeding cannot be inflicted. And so, in having this, I solve one ailment. And I'll talk about the other two ailments in a little bit. But the next item of note that I think is very important to talk about is Defiance of Destiny. And this gives us a 38% life dampen for a hit. So if we're being hit by a very massive hit, we're mitigating a lot of its damage through Defiance of Destiny, Progenesis, and a Blood Notch Immutable Force. So Blood Notch Immutable Force is a post-hit recovery setup. If we're getting hit by a stunning hit, we're going to be recovering 60% of that damage. Now, Progenesis makes it so that we dampen a big hit. And when we dampen this big hit, we end up taking the damage over 4 seconds, which is almost like canceled out. If not, like, I'm recovering life over this 4 seconds after being hit due to Blood Notch. And so that kind of gives us a very, very big defensive layer against smaller hits. And the only real thing this build struggles with is Uber Elder Shaper Slam, which obviously you need like some sort of guard skill to mitigate. I don't have a manual cast guard skill set up, so obviously I just dodged that. On top of this, if I get hit by one hit and it procs my cast from damage taken, which is a level 1, I'm going to have a Mortal Call going, and this is going to be going for about 2.25 seconds, which obviously is it's a lot of time, since you're probably going to be getting chain hit with attacks if you're taking those types of hits. And that's just literally 26 and 27% less LE and physical damage taken. So, yeah, this build has an absurd amount of EHP for the small life pool that it has. And you don't really need a big life pool unless you're trying to tank, like, Uber Slams. As in the showcase, I am literally able just to sit in Exarch Ball Phase and just not have to worry about it. Okay, so talked a lot about the defensive layers. This build is absurd with that, since we're also running Flask Finder and like all these elemental flasks. Spell suppression capped. Let's look at the element immunities. Corrupted Blood on some sort of jewel. You can literally get it from your Abyss jewel, or you can just get it from like a rare jewel if you're not running like a Watcher's Eye, if you're not running something else. If you're too starved for currency, you can obviously run a Ming's Heart and maybe get poison immunity on this prefixes, which is what I was running before I got Original Sin. Now I have an unaffected by poison while I have Malevolence, and dot multi-Malevolence with some nice leech on this cluster, on this Watcher's Eye. And I'm solving ailment immunity through taking these nodes, and a ailment immunity while phasing, as well as a charm here. I have crafted on boots, which I actually need to change out, as I made this swap literally just quite recently, because I found that the Explodey charm is not necessary anymore for me. The overall ailment immunity is going to be really nice, just because you don't get hit by big ignites, you don't have to worry about freeze and all that. Freeze and chill are already kind of solved through Taste of Fate, but shock and ignite are kind of the things you need to cover. And having 100% is just really useful. I'm always phasing because I have 100% flask uptime. And I'm doing this by using a 35% increased effect cluster. And these 6 nodes give me plenty of flask duration, as well as a lot of attributes. Now, this build requires you to have 300 dex and 150 int. How I'm finding these is through pathing from Ranger, and then strength through a lethal pride, and intelligence just from pathing up from the Ranger tree, as well as some on cluster jewels. And one thing to note as well, some wands, if you're running an explode wand, some of the bases that these are on are probably going to be 212 int. So you need exactly 212, and I managed to find that. But okay, let's take a look at what this Lethal Pride does. I got endgame Lethal Pride to take 15% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage. This is very endgame defensively, and there's probably not going to be anything better for this tree that I can find. The other charms is just going to be reservation. I'm reserving a lot of auras and max fire since we're taking so much fizz as fire, and I'm not using a lightning coil, so I'm dependent on kind of the setup to mitigate more fizz damage. Now, the hexproof enemies setup is just to allow for us to chain temp chains, and that is really important if we're trying to clear maps, and I also want to be able to do hexproof maps. So, yeah. Nearby enemies are chilled is really nice because it just slows action speed, and since we need to be nearby in order to utilize the original Sin mod, giving them 0 chaos res, I'd rather have a little bit of extra safety just standing next to some pretty nasty soul eater mobs. And yeah. Now, the sort of last little thing to note on the tree is that there's a lot of flexibility with where you can path. If you solved ailment immunity and you don't need these nodes and you have enough dex, you can run a different path. You can obviously spec more damage. There's more damage up here. 10% more damage to enemies with ES is pretty good. And you can also scale frenzy charges if you're doing frenzy charge on hit. I am not because I don't really care for that. The damage of this build is more than enough. And also, you can run a wand with better cast speed and better dot multi. What I was running before this was 35% increased chaos to chaos dot multi and 30 something percent cast speed, and all it had was no explode mod. So the cost there is you probably want to run an explode charm then, and so you won't have the increased poison duration. Which obviously gives up a little bit of single target, but it kind of cancels that as well. I still think having an explode one is better, but that's just kind of the high-end investment, which I wanted to shell out for. And besides that, I mean, I'm running a rarity helmet for absolutely no reason whatsoever, besides the fact that I felt like it. Yeah, you want a decent pool of ES for EB, as every cast is like draining a decent bit of ES. And it's not really noticeable, to be dead honest, but it is nice to have more ES. Like, you're probably fine with 500 ES, so you could run like a better helmet for like more evasion. Now, as far as the gems that I'm running for auras and stuff, I'm running Malevolence, Grace, and Haste as my big auras, and you also need a Herald of Agony for 20% chance to poison on hit. This is also just kind of nice to give us more poison damage. But in order to have this setup work, I needed an Enlighten 4, which is scaled up by +1. And I also need a Arrogance setup for my Vitality. I have a max level Vitality. My overall life regen is 873.4 because I'm also using a regen flask. And this allows me to just recover a lot more life through other means. Other flasks is just move speed, cast speed. You can swap cast speed out or move speed out for like something else. If you really want rarity, you can go for that. You can go for reduced mana cost if you can't roll with high ES, but I mean, that's kind of pointless. You need flask duration in order to keep these flasks up, so a flask belt is really good. This one is a belt I've had since the league start, so you know you can run any belt. It doesn't need to be a Stygian, doesn't need to be Hunter, all that. It's just extra life. So yeah, I mean the actual gearing for this build is I would say flexible. Like you don't need a +2. You don't need a lot of this. You do give up damage here and there. But Ubers are so comfortable for me. Like the only one that sucks is Maven if I get hit by degen or um any crappy no recovery in the last phase. But besides that, all the other bosses are just so easy and like with a proper setup, you can tank Shaper Slam and Uber Elder. It's a very good feared farmer. It can do most of the mods. It can do insane like chain increased AoE because you just don't take lethal damage very often. And yeah, I think that Penance Brand is probably going to need some tuning next league, and if it stays around, I'm hoping to see some people like come up with some new tech for it. There's nothing too complicated about it. The playstyle is so simple that you can really just like chill out with it. But yeah, till next time. Cheers.